All right, welcome to the Gateway API meeting for September 25. Wow, time is moving quickly. This is a standard Kubernetes meeting, a community meeting. That means we abide by the Kubernetes Code of Conduct. At a high level, this just means to be nice to each other. Couple notes, really encourage people to definitely take some time to comment on anything they might have a question about or thoughts about. We really do value feedback from any and all perspective. And to make sure that we hear everyone out, I encourage people to use Zoom's raise hand feature so that we're not talking over people. Yeah, that's a high level thing. I don't see any, oh, maybe. If anyone is new or hasn't had a chance to introduce themselves yet, give just a minute or so for someone to introduce themselves if they want to. No pressure at all, but we do like to hear what brings people to this meeting and what their interest in Gateway API is. Cool. Okay. So I'll just keep on moving here. The first thing up on the agenda is really quick. Uh, this is, I think, the third time we're doing this now, but the first meeting of every month is going to be an earlier time slot to better accommodate people east of the West Coast, so in the US, so that includes other continents such as Europe and Africa, as well as even just the US East Coast and others better. So if that time works better, or if you know people who are interested and would like to make this meeting but can't make this time slot, please let them know that next week and again the first week of every month we meet at a different time. Okay, next up is a discussion point that I think gained a lot of steam in last week's meeting. And this was all about listener isolation or cascading behavior. We found in the spec that although we made assumptions about how we thought this would work, those assumptions were not clearly written in the spec, which is very, very unfortunate. And not only were they not clearly written in the spec, they were not clearly described in conformance tests either. So there were a lot of assumptions that were made here that unfortunately not every implementation matched perfectly. So the implementations of Gateway API roughly fall into two categories today, and that is that listeners are isolated. So once you pick a listener, you only get forwarded to backends attached to that, attached to routes attached to that listener, or cascading behavior, which means that if there's no match on the current listener, you might cascade to a different listener. The cascading behavior is particularly problematic when it comes to TLS, among other things, and just having inconsistency here is not good for the Gateway API ecosystem as a whole, because one of our big value propositions is consistency across the ecosystem. So I think everyone is hopefully I'm not misrepresenting here, but I think maybe most people want to see the community move towards a model of listener isolation, where a single listener is selected, and then from there, only routes attached to that listener are chosen. So there's a fair amount of discussion here. Nick gave a great introduction to this. Shane added some comments. Shane, Nick, and myself met a few days ago to discuss this in more detail. And we have a proposal here, but I know everyone has different opinions. So I just want to, again, show the proposal that we think will work for most, hopefully everyone here. And that is to add a new gateway listener isolation extended feature along with conformance tests that will describe the ideal state that we want everyone to work towards. We think that some new features, particularly client cert validation, which Arco has proposed, are likely going to require support for listener isolation, because without listener isolation, you could effectively bypass client cert validation, which is just not a good thing. Yeah, so need to be very, very, very careful there. But the other thing is we really don't want to leave anyone behind, although I think we all had a very, well, maintainers had a clear idea of how we wanted this to work. It was not clearly written down. It was not, there were a bunch of missteps here. So that is why this is not, intended to be a breaking change where everyone has to move before V1. This is intended to be a directional change where we want to encourage people to move as quickly as reasonably possible to this approach, so that we can make this a core and required feature in the future. But we recognize that it will take some time for people to make this transition. So we need a way to represent the two different states while they exist, while also encouraging people to move as quickly as possible to this. Any comments or questions on this approach? Concerns? Anything? Yeah, I recognize this could affect some implementations more than others. So please take some time, think about this. If you're already in camp listener isolation, this should be no op for you. If you are not there yet, please, take some time, comment, etc. It would be great to hear from you.
But yeah, I think it is important to call out that it's really important to emphasize, that we want to make sure everyone understands that we will be moving this to core at some point in the future. Like we don't want this sort of distinction between unisolated listeners and isolated listeners to stick around forever. Michael asks in the chat, is it possible to implement listener isolation with intersecting listener hostname fields? Yes. So the intent here is what we intended originally, which is that if the hostname fields intersect, you pick one based on the existing hostname sort of distinctiveness rules. And then once one is picked, that's it. You can't match more than one. So the most common case here is that you have a precise hostname and a wildcard hostname in two separate listener fields. And the rules say, and the intent is that if you have that case, the precise hostname listener matches before the wildcard listener, and you can't sort of, where this has come up is that when sometimes people have a precise match with path foo and a wildcard match with path bar, and if you go to the precise match path bar, you should get a 404 with listener isolation, because you've matched the precise match and then there is no path for bar in the routes attached to the precise match. You should not be able to sort of back out to the listener and pick a different hostname, pick a different set of routes attached to the star listener. This is also complicated further by the fact that there's another layer of sort of hostname definition in the listener and route hostname distinction. But again, the intent here is that the listener and route hostname sort of interaction is really about routes being able to match with particular listeners on the gateway. So if you have a wildcard listener on the a wildcard hostname on the listener and a precise hostname on the route, then the route will attach to the precise to the wildcard listener. If you have a precise hostname on the listener and a wildcard hostname on the route, then the route will attach to the precise listener. If you have a wildcard hostname on both, then they'll both attach. If you have different precise hostnames on both, then the route will not attach to that listener. And so the thing that's important here is what happens when you've got different hostnames, distinct values for hostnames on the listener, regardless of whether or not they intersect in terms of being precise or wildcard. Now, I mean, have another read of the, I tried to explain this as well as I could in the initial comment. in the initial sort of opening post. Yeah, so but yeah, have a look through that, and if anything is unclear, please ask on there. But I think yeah, a careful read there should explain a bit more. And thank you for the example, Michael, as well. That really helped me to sort of make this more clear. Candice.
Just a quick question. Does this have any impact on coalescing? The connection coalescing?
Maybe. So the intent here is that you mean HTTP2 connection coalescing over a single TLS connection?
Probably. I don't know exactly
Yeah.
the different ways that connection coalescing happens, but it's something that I want to learn more about.
Yeah. So yes, this config is kind of intended to represent how traffic is routed once it gets to the gateway. If the gateway is allowing sort of coalescing of HTTP connections for separate hosts under a single listener, there is actually another issue open about making SNI and hostname, making sure that SNI and hostname match, which again is very important for yeah, thanks Rob, this one, which is very important for when you start adding client certificates. But again, it is John pointed out, and thanks for pointing this out, John, that yeah, we've got to remember about 421 status code, connection coalescing, and a couple of other things. So it'll make writing this a little bit more complicated, as is always the case when it comes to TLS. And so yes, we do need to take that into account, but I don't think that the listener matching semantics that we're talking about in 2416 will have too much of an impact. This is the thing that will have an impact on connection coalescing. I hope, anyway. We'll have to wait and see.
Thanks.
Yeah, I think we can come back to this specific issue in triage, but yeah, these two are very, very closely related. Any additional comments or questions on this one? Cool. All right. Well, thank you for the feedback. Thank you to there's been, although this issue is fairly isolated, this is coming out of a larger discussion that I know many people were involved in. So thank you both. Thank you everyone for being involved in this and helping us come to some kind of conclusion here. But again, would appreciate any additional feedback here before we move forward. I expect that this is something we're going to have to move forward with this week, given our timeline for release and all the rest. Michael asks again, is there an implementation that does both things correctly? I think there are some Envoy-based implementations that handle this, handle listener isolation the way that we are expecting here. I don't want to name names and be wrong here, but I believe Istio and Envoy Gateway may both be matching the behavior described here as listener isolation, but someone can correct me if I'm wrong there.
Yeah, I haven't had a chance to test either, but my understanding is those ones possibly Contour, although I can't remember whether we did something similar for HTTP proxy, but I can't remember if that has been ported to Gateway API or not.
And we do have some awareness that this is at least possible in Nginx, but I don't believe any Nginx based implementations are doing this right now. Cool. All right, I'll keep on moving. Don't hesitate to bring up any additional comments, concerns as we go here. We can come back to this one. Next up, V1.0 is coming awfully quickly. So let me just run through release blockers real quick. You're starting to notice that although the number is not changing, it's because we have a lot of these showing up as PRs that are addressing the issues. And I feel fairly good about where we are at this point. Yeah, and I'm not seeing a lot. I think what I identified as our biggest concern is that issue that we just discussed. And as long as we're okay with the approach that we proposed here, we should be able to fit this one in as well. But we do definitely want to have a clear path forward and a path towards listener isolation as the primary and eventually only way forward. Cool. And we are targeting, so for those of you who have been around Gateway API for a while, we kick off a API review before we do any release, any kind of minor or major release. And that means talking to SIGNet tech leads and API reviewers. This time we're planning to start that process next week. We're trying to get everyone lined up in terms of availability. But right now that's looking like maybe October 4, so mid to late next week is when we hope to see that process begin, which means we're really trying to be code complete before then, at least as far as any API changes. Documentation and such can continue to take some time, but that means we've got a lot to get in a fairly short window here. All right, next up is there's some more logo options. Some of you may have already seen this already. This is continuing on the existing issue here, but Pierre-Louis actually during the last community meeting came up with a sketch that I thought was particularly clever. So I actually reached out to Lauren, who ended up coming up with some designs based on Pierre-Louis' sketch, and they are outlined below in this issue. Would really appreciate some feedback here. You know, we are trying to have options that we can vote on by the end of the month, but we're also trying to not overwhelm everyone with 10 different options to vote from or something like that. So if you can help narrow down which one of these or which couple of these we add to the list to vote from, that would be great. But right now I'm just encouraging some emoji style voting here. And if you have any comments or other ideas, feel free to add them as comments. And also really, really appreciate if you have any other ideas, you know, other suggestions are welcome here too. But yeah, just a few more options to consider for Gateway API. I didn't add this in the comment, but the high level idea that Pierre-Louis had here was to show that Gateway API was not just north-south traffic, but also east-west. And that's why you get, you know, I think maybe it's clearest in this orientation, but in either one, you're trying to show that traffic is both going, I mean, I guess this is not exactly east-west, but the idea is both north-south and east-west. And maybe a gateway in the middle, depending on your perspective. Yeah, so comments, feedback, etc., all very welcome on this one. Cool. I will keep on moving. Yeah. I added this again to handle another release blocker. There's a partially invalid condition I'm proposing to add to routes, and this is something we've been circling around for an awfully long time. But it is to figure out what to do when you have a single or a set of route rules that are invalid within a route, but you still have other route rules that are valid. So some kind of mixed state for a route, which is really tricky to handle in Gateway API today. There's been an issue where there was some discussion around this, and we kind of, again, went around a few different ideas here. I've proposed an option here. I would really appreciate feedback on this because, again, this is another thing we're trying to get it in the next week or so. But at a high level, I'm proposing that we actually allow two different kinds of behavior here. One kind of allowed behavior here is that when implementations set this behavior, they may choose to drop the rules that are invalid. This could be considered failing fast. This is particularly useful for implementations that cannot handle, do not have state, right? So you don't want to use the other approach, which would be a fallback to last known good state, because if your implementation for any reason restarts, gets updated, etc., you lose that, and then you break at a future point in time, which may be less predictable, etc. But on the other hand, there are some implementations that would prefer to fall back. And with that approach, implementations fall back to the last known good state of the entire route. And there's some guidance on what the message would say for either case. But this is a little unconventional in that we're providing two possible ways to handle a invalid state. And not just that, I also don't think that we can write conformance tests for this, because the only paths I can think of to get to an invalid state are fairly implementation specific, specifically an unsupported value or unsupported feature, which is, again, going to be very implementation specific. Or it would be blocked by our validation or some subset of that. So this is really intended primarily just to be a set of guidelines for two different ways you can handle this state, which, although it's not just a single way, I think it is preferable to have some guidelines on how you can handle this. Any thoughts, concerns about this?
So I must admit to feeling a little bit uncomfortable about the sort of the last known good state. I've talked about that before, but this is about as good a way as to handle both possibilities as I can think of. So I'm fine with this.
Yeah, and in my opinion, I think last known good state is really best used for implementations that, one, have a means of restoring the state through state transitions, but then two, especially useful for implementations where it may take a protracted period of time to restore, to transition between good and bad config. Right. So if you're going to drop a rule and then it takes a couple minutes to restore that rule, that's a very different story than if it's going to take 2 seconds to restore that rule.
So one issue potentially with the last known good state is you might have an audit log that does not align with what is actually happening on the system. Unless we have some directive to say that when it falls back, it emits an equally strong audit rule or audit log or signature.
Well, yeah, that's the idea behind having these conditions, is so that these conditions are effectively the audit log or signature. Yeah, so like part of, again, this is something that we haven't explicitly said in enough places, but part of the contract that's expected for Gateway API implementations and Gateway API users is that the conditions on various objects are important and you must monitor them. So watch for changes, take action, and look for changes and stuff like that. I'm actually writing like an implementer's guide that is going to be in addition to the spec that will sort of make some of these things a little bit more clear, with the intent being that eventually we'll have a more solid user's guide that tells you things like, hey, you need to watch the conditions for the various objects.
Yeah, and I would say that that this is a very unique. So far, every implementation is doing something for this, but there's no standardized way to report this. So every implementation is doing their own thing. What we're trying to accomplish here is somewhat unique in that we're trying to add a new condition and require every implementation to set this condition so that hopefully any plugin, any dashboard, anything that consumes Gateway API has a standardized way of recognizing there's a problem here and it falls into this category of problems, and I can alert based on that, right? So whatever implementation you're using, this provides some kind of portable feedback that there is a problem and this is what it is. So yeah, this is trying to address that very specific state, and I agree that both fallback and dropping it, neither are great. I would say that dropping immediately is pretty hostile in its own state, but at least the failure happens closest to when the configuration happens, so someone's paying attention, that knows what they did and knows what triggered it, hopefully. Fallback is, a little bit friendlier to customers potentially at the cost of it may not be obvious for them that something broke. So you need to be very good at bubbling this up and surfacing that to your users.
Yeah,
I've fallen behind on chat here.
Yeah, Michael asked in chat, is this the first time we prescribe that a message has to start with a prefix? And does this mean that messages are now part of the API? And I said yes and yes. It's not ideal, but again, nothing about this particular situation is ideal. I would much prefer that messages are like Go error messages, in that you can't make any statements about them. But in this case, unless we change the condition struct to have like some other field that and which I've tried before and it didn't work out, this is the best option we have.
Yeah. So I would say this is not ideal. I don't love I don't love this, but I feel like it's very important for this API to have a standardized way to represent these partially valid states, because right now every implementation I'm aware of is handling this in some kind of inconsistent way. And we need shared tooling, common tooling to be able to understand and alert or warn based on this state. I may have cut someone off.
No, yeah, I was just gonna say, Travis suggested in chat as well, could we add a this makes the rule fail, this makes the rule invalid filter, and then use that as a way to test this? It kind of makes sense, I guess. That might be a good way to do that. And actually having that sort of filter available is actually not that bad an idea.
Yeah, I think it feels a little funny, but maybe, yeah, I hate to let nonsense through validation, but maybe that's just required here. Feels funny, but yeah, that's the only way I could think to conformance test this. So yeah, good idea. Okay, so that is 2429 feedback. Very welcome and appreciated on this one. Would also be helpful to know, I think many, if not most, implementations fall into bucket 1 right now. But it would be interesting to hear if you fall into neither of these buckets right now, and if there's some other category that we're missing here. Cool. All right. With that, Gaurav has a very cool PR to add Gateway Cuddle to the Gateway API repo. No pressure, but do you have anything you can demo, Gaurav? Are you on this call?
Hey, hi, Rob. Yeah, I'm on
Hey.
this call. Yes, I think we have made some progress and I can show something new than what we did last time. So if you give me
Cool.
the option, okay, I think I can
Yeah,
share
you
my
should be able to have
All right. Give me a moment.
So while Gaurav is starting us up, this has been something that you've probably seen in at least one previous meeting, but Gateway Cuddle is really trying to fill the gaps of both policy attachment and the limitations of kubectl when it comes to interacting with CRDs. With upstream Kubernetes APIs, you can define all kinds of custom logic for kubectl. You can't with CRDs. And Gaurav has done some awesome work here to fill a lot of gaps. And this is actually the first time I'll see this demo, so I'm excited to see what it looks like.
Hey, thanks for the intro, Rob. So I'm guessing mostly it might be similar to last time, but there have been a couple of improvements in terms of calculating effective policy. So as we know, policies can be attached to resources like gateway class, gateways, namespaces, and if it's an inherited policy, then it could affect all the sub-resources within that. So one of the first things is that you should, when you list all policies, you will be able to see whether a policy is inherited or if it's a directly attached policy. So for example, what this means is that an inherited policy would be something like, so an inherited policy is supposed to have, I think, mostly two fields. One is the defaults and overrides. And within these, you can have subfields. Defaults is like given, so there's a precedence order between overrides and defaults and how these interact on with various resources. For example, this policy is attached to the gateway class, so it will have like the highest precedence. Then we have this policy attached on the namespace resource. So what this means is that if I were to list all HTTP routes within the default namespace, then I should be able to, whoops, there was it. And I should be able to see like the effect of all these policies on my HTTP route. For example, describing an HTTP route, you will get a section called effective policies, which will group policies by their kind and their gateways. So what this means is that the effective policy for this particular HTTP route, when it comes to this gateway, is this. And these are all the policies which are attached to either this HTTP route or the gateway or any other top level resource. Effective policy basically means if there's multiple policies of similar kind attached on any place in the hierarchy, then we should be able to kind of calculate the effective or figure out which fields take precedence over the others. For example, in this case, timeout policy was attached to both the gateway and the namespace. So that is why you can see that some fields were derived from the parent, some fields were derived from the child. That is essentially what calculating effective policy means. If the HTTP route is attached to multiple gateways, then you will be able to see effective policies for each particular gateway. So the effective policies are grouped currently by which gateway you're referring to. In addition to HTTP routes, we have support for some more resources like backends. Right now, if you don't specify any type over here, the default backend is assumed to be a service. So describing backends lists all services which are within the default namespace. And similarly, you can see which gateways this is attached to or which gateways are referring this particular service and the effective policies which affect this particular packet. If I were to, let's say, so people could have custom resources in the place of services. So what you can do is in that case, you would be saying, hey, I want to list, let's say, if let's assume for now that if gateway was a backend, then you could do something like this. So what this will do is it will list all backends which are of this particular kind. Right now, I'm assuming that a gateway is kind of backend, and in this case, it will show you it will treat this resource as a backend and again calculate the effective policy for it. In this case, it wasn't able to kind of figure. So since no HTTP route was referencing this particular kind of backend, you don't see any effective policies. There's only directly attached policies to this particular resource. And yeah, I think that's it. Mostly there's been changes and advancements on calculating the effective policy since last time. Any questions, thoughts, comments are welcomed.
Oh, that looks awesome. That's my thoughts. No, seriously. Yeah, I think it just looks really cool. Yeah, that effective policies looks very much like what I talked about on the thing. So yeah, just nice work, great work.
That's great.
Yeah,
Okay, I think
I'm
stop
really
sharing.
excited about this. I can't wait. I think Gateway Cuddle is soon going to be the default way people interact with Gateway API, which I think is just going to make the experience that much better. Even without policy, you've already provided some great improvements, and then adding policy on top, I think it's going to be a great win. And we can only expand from here. So yeah, thanks for driving this forward.
I guess so. Is the question that you were also asking here, like, should we look at moving this into the repo?
So yes, right now I think it has reached that stage where I feel confident that okay, it can be moved, but it's totally up to you, the reviewers. Please take a look whenever you get some time at the PR and see if there's any changes that you'd like. And definitely I need to add some more tests. I have added some tests, but yes, definitely that area needs some improvement, or it can always need improvement.
Yeah, totally.
I think the idea right now is that this plugin Gateway Cuddle is something that is critical for Gateway API usage, UX, etc., and we want it to be bundled with Gateway API release. With that said, I think that we need to have different sets of dependencies. So this comes in with a different go.mod, etc. So we're not adding dependencies that every implementation needs to fight with. And I think we would also class this as experimental channel. We don't really have channels per se this is a new concept, but we want to be clear that this is not a GA product in the first release. This is just experimental. It will continue to grow and evolve. But I think it is important for it to live alongside the rest of Gateway, because as new Gateway features come in, I'd love to see them added immediately to this as well. Yeah, great work. I can't wait to see this one come through. I think this is going to be a huge win for everyone. All right, hopefully I'm going to share the right thing again. Did I share the wrong? What did I share?
You shared your
Okay.
screen. Yeah.
Sweet. Highly secretive. Maybe this one looks better. All right. Okay, cool. With that, I think we're just about done. We're at triage now. So first up, I wanted to make sure we had time to get back into this discussion a little bit more. Nick, I don't know if you have more to say on this one, or if we just follow up offline, but it's a pretty big topic. I personally am of the mind that I don't know that we can add this restriction to Gateway API. I think it's going to be really complicated at a minimum, and there's so many, because RFCs don't require it. Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, it could be that this is another one where we need to have an extended feature that we probably would suggest that most people have on. But yeah, as John said, we also like the initial rule I've got there definitely needs rewriting to handle 421's connection coalescing and some other stuff like that. But the intent here is to sort of say, hey, remember that having no relationship between the SNI and the hostname at all can also be really bad. If your rule set is rendered as a set of SNI matches and a set of hostname matches, it is possible, and there's sort of no link between them, and there's no sort of you don't subdivide the set of hostname matches based on the SNI. Then you can it can make it easier to do sort of swinging between backends kinds of things, and ignoring the front end part. I think once we are sort of pushing for listener isolation more, it becomes much harder, because then your rules should be written in such a fashion that that any domain fronting you do will only be to other, will be limited, because of the way the listener isolation works. But it is still important for us to talk about this at some point, I think. So I don't think this one's a GA blocker, especially if we once we do the listener isolation, but we do need to think about it and talk about it at some point.
Yeah, I agree with everything you said. I think that this is not GA blocking. It's something that we can talk about in more detail later on. And I'm really hopeful that listener isolation will resolve a lot of the major concerns here. I recognize, this is not everything, but I think we need to be very, very, very careful about anything like this and make sure we've thought it through properly, because going above and beyond what is restricted elsewhere can be challenging. Yeah. Okay. I think that's all for that one then. And then backend protocol, I think this is Dave's, right?
Yeah.
Dave, are you on the call? Yeah.
Can you hear me? Oh, hold on.
Yep.
Okay. Yeah, I think I addressed everything. I think Nick, for you, it's I've done a bit of changes based on Rob's feedback to simplify, I think, the table, and marked a bunch of stuff as optional.
Yeah, I'll check this one. I'll check this one at some point today.
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah, I think this is really, really close. I have no issue with this one. This one getting in. There's also this is one gap that I think is on pace to make it. Again, pending feedback from Nick, but this one feels really close, and it basically amounts to here's app protocol and here's how you should use it, roughly. Maybe that's an oversimplification of the gap, but I think it's good to have this specified. I don't think we actually do we need API changes for this? Like any changes to spec, Dave?
I would take some of this and put it into the Go doc, like some of the rules of
in like backend reference, maybe?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, that's fair. Okay.
Yeah. And I think the other place where we'll be able to call this out is in the implementer's guide as well when I finish that PR, which should be in the next couple of days.
Yeah, let me know and I can do a follow-up.
And one other thing while I'm thinking about gaps that are right on the verge of getting in, John has one for in-cluster gateways. That has been approved. There's one pending comment on it, but I think once that comment is resolved, it can merge, and that one would also be good to get in.
I think you pasted that in the header for the next meeting, Rob.
And that was not me, but I can try and follow where it's going. Yeah, okay, that's the same one. All right. Okay, so I think that's all that I'm aware of. Anyone want to add any last minute things to the agenda? I think that's the one we just discussed, right? Yeah.
Yeah, it is cool. Okay, good.
Cool.
Right.
All right. Yeah, well, thank you everyone for the great discussion. Oh, there is one more triage item. Okay, whoever is typing that, feel free to bring it up or I can follow a link in the agenda. Dangerous link. Oh. I choose not to follow. Perfect. That may be the first time this this meeting got rickrolled. Well done. But anyways, yes, have a good rest of your week. Thank you everyone for the great discussion today. I remember we're basically 10 days out from starting the review process for 1.0, which means that everything really needs to get in the next week. So if you're not getting reviews and you want reviews, please ping whoever needs to be reviewing your code, and don't hesitate to ping me personally if I can help get people reviewing, or if I can review myself. But we do want to make sure that we can get what we had prioritized as 1.0 into 1.0. With that, I think we're at time. So thanks everyone for the discussion. Cool. Have a good one.
Bye-bye.